My name is Kathy Fuentes-Rohr, and I'm the chairperson of the Indiana Coalition for Public Education of Monroe County and South Central Indiana. We are an organization that's aim is to help people connect the dots between what happens at the State House and in federal education policy and how it directly affects our kids and our teachers in the public schools. And so from the film that you just saw, we saw that was set in Colorado, we saw how outside money is influencing greatly the experience of kids and teachers in schools and privatizing our public schools. We ourselves in Indiana have an ALEC legislature, but present company accepted. And our chairperson of the Indiana Education Committee was former state chairman of ALEC for 8 years, Bob Baining. So anyway, I'd like to present our panel. Each of them are going to speak for about 4 to 5 minutes, and then you all should have a note card. And if you don't, you can raise your hand. We'll have these people over here on the side ready to grab it for you, and we can have a question and answer so we can have a discussion. So, first, I think to give us an overall background and sort of frame the money behind corporate education reform, I have Steve Hinnefeld, who is a wonderful education blogger. The blog is called In School Matters, and you should sign up to get it because he really helps inform us in a way that we don't always get from our newspapers. And so maybe, Steve, you can just go first, I guess.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and say just a few things, try to keep it brief, and look forward to questions. Sorry. Is this better? You got me now? Okay, sorry. I'll say a few things and try to keep it brief and look forward to some questions. It's a big topic, and there's really a whole lot we could say and a whole lot we could talk about, including certainly ALEC, which was part of the film. The film was really interesting. I want to say this really briefly. Colorado's a kind of Wild West, one of the various Wild West locales of education reform, Indiana being another place, but in Colorado seems to be a lot of things happening at the district level. And these are, it doesn't really come across so much in the film, I don't think. I don't know if anybody's discussed this. These are very large suburban school districts, Douglas County and Jefferson County both. I think Jefferson County has like 87,000 students. Douglas County has 64,000 students, something like that. So the largest school districts in Indiana have about 32,000 students, IPS and Fort Wayne. So they're more than twice as big as the largest districts in Indiana, and they're very suburban and very non-diverse, almost entirely white, not much poverty. Really interesting that this particular type of ideology had took hold there. It would be sort of as if this sort of thing happened in Carmel or Fishers, maybe. It really, I mean, it is, arguably it is the most interesting school district in America, and whether not necessarily a good thing. And there's sort of a happy ending to the story, or a partially happy ending in that I don't know if anybody's talked about this or not, but the Douglas County Board was recalled. The 3 members were voted out who weren't even up for election, and 2 other members I think came in. So there's a pro-public education board that's taken over in Douglas County, or I'm sorry, in Jefferson County. In Douglas County, there was an election, not a recall, if I'm correct, and the pro-public education slate won 3 of the 7, the 3 seats that were up out of the 7, so there's still a minority, but it should be changing the tenor of that board, and I haven't followed what's going on there. Indiana, I think, is another Wild West of education reform. And it's happened somewhat differently. I mean, the money has not been, there's been a lot of outside money that's come into Indiana, but also a lot of state money and a lot of people affiliated with Mitch Daniels and Mike Pence who have pushed a particular vision of educational change. And one of the posts that I wrote a couple years ago, I guess, drew on a presentation that a fellow named Fred Klipsch had made. Fred Klipsch is the head of what's now called Hoosiers for quality education. It used to be called Hoosiers for Economic Growth. And he lays out in this PowerPoint presentation that's online. You can read it. At least I think it's online, or at least it's you can download it from my blog post, if nothing else. We talked about how he set out, very strategically with a plan to remake Indiana education in this particular market-based model that involves expansion of charter schools, creation of a very expansive school voucher program, reduction of collective bargaining rights for teachers, and a new form of teacher evaluations. And he did this they did it very strategically in terms of electing people to office, electing Tony Bennett to office in 2008, and putting a lot of money into state legislative elections in order to counteract what they saw as the quote-unquote the problem of the state teachers unions, primarily the ISTA. And they did it, and they pulled off exactly the plan. They passed all the legislation they wanted to. And it's really interesting. A lot of the money came from, I'll just kind of touch on this really briefly. A lot of the money came to this group now called Hoosiers for Quality Education. And a lot of it came by way of another organization called the American Federation for Children, which is a national organization, but in its Indiana fundraising uses the same address as the law office of Jim Bopp. Some of you probably know who Jim Bopp is. He's former member of the Republican National Committee, a lawyer in Terre Haute, who was real involved in the Citizens United case before the Supreme Court and various efforts to sort of free campaign finance and campaign spending. So they collected very large donations in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, primarily from the Walton family, the Walmart owners, Allison and Jim Walton primarily, and also from some other wealthy people, some hedge fund managers in Pennsylvania and New York, and the American Federation for Children is a national organization that advocates for school choice and school vouchers, headed by the DeVos, Richard and Betsy DeVos, D-E-V-O-S, I think I'm saying that right, who are, I believe, heirs to the Amway fortune. So there's a lot of money that kind of has come in to influence, a lot of money that's come in from outside the state to influence policy, but certainly a lot of people within the state who agree with that direction that things have gone in at the state level, and a lot of people in the state legislature now, especially as a result of the 2010 elections and the redistricting that took place that created pretty solid Republican supermajorities in both the House and Senate. So it's been an interesting 5 years. I'll just say that.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you again for all the research you do in the blog, because I love that blog. Next speaker is our friend Marianne Ruger, who is a parent of two up in Indianapolis, and has paid close attention to all of the charters and voucher and corporate education reform that's been happening there, and is very personal to her and her neighbors. So,
thank you. Is that good now? Is that fine? Okay. As I told Kathy a few days ago, I don't really go looking for all of that information. It comes and finds me in my house where I live and the children that I know, because as you may or may not know, for those of us who live within IPS, we've been kind of a choice district for a long time, although we didn't call it that. We called it magnets, and it was intended for desegregation and equity. But with some changes in federal Supreme Court cases several years ago, we can no longer use magnets in that way with a racial assignment process. And once that law weakened, now our magnets have kind of become a different thing, and they're kind of melting into just regular choice. Be careful what you do, because sometimes it backs you in a corner, maybe is the lesson of that. At this point, as an IPS taxpayer, I feel like I'm on a giant chessboard, And I feel like my children and my neighbor's children and my neighbor's neighbor children are all kind of pawns on this chessboard, to borrow a very outworn way of saying it. But the school district does certain things, partly, maybe to escape an F grade on one school or to escape 3 or 4 F grades on one school, they will change the enrollment around, or they will start a new program, or they do all of these things. But now we have so many different federal and state pressures coming in that we've kind of lost our freedom to operate, and we're trapped in. And a lot of people are enjoying that feeling of trapping us, I think. So I guess I would just say be careful what you do wherever you are, because it can come back to haunt you. Specifically, I think maybe what I'm supposed to talk about tonight is what it's been like to go through the last 3 IPS school board elections. I had never worked on an election until 2010. I always said I was not political, and I've discovered that you have no choice, because everything does become political. In 2010, I was asked by my neighbor, who was very involved in school affairs, to just stand at the polls and pass out papers for one of the school board candidates, Annie Roof, who's a longtime IPS parent, IPS graduate, normal, regular, ordinary, and wonderful person. And so I did that. And it was her first time up, and she won. And she won on a budget of, as I'm looking down through my notes here, she won on a budget that appears to have been under $2,000, which was all raised, I believe, from friends and maybe a couple of family members who are definitely not wealthy that may have been out of state. Looking ahead in 2012, when some other board members were up for election, the amounts jumped hugely. They jumped to where people were turning in campaign finance reports that had $50,000 or $60,000, and they had a little bit of outside the state money, but mainly the issue then was it was outside the district money, coming from Carmel or maybe coming from Brownsburg. A little bit of the national stuff you're seeing in the movie, but still large amounts that had never been seen before. Coming forward to 2014, when Annie Roof ran again and lost, but raised around, I think, $11,000 or $12,000, including some money from the local teachers union, I think maybe the bus drivers union, and a lot of friends giving $25 and $50 and $100. The winning candidates in 2014, Lanier Eccles, who incidentally is a charter school principal, but serves on the public IPS school board, turned in $65,000. Kelly Bentley, who is a former longtime IPS parent and had been on the board before, but is also very involved in a lot of ed reform organizations now, turned in $52,000, and Marianne Sullivan turned in $73,000. So the amounts weren't that much different from 2012, but the difference comes when you look at the campaign finance report. And for instance, Lanier Eccles, who has lived in Indianapolis maybe 3 or 4 years at the time that she ran, and has no other Indianapolis connections, had money coming, large amounts of money coming from the Indianapolis Chamber of Commerce, from Leadership and Educational Excellence out of Washington, D.C., which is, I believe, actually part of Teach for America.
It's a political action.
Over $11,000.
America, right?
Yeah, over $11,000 came in for her. The head of the Friedman Foundation, the Board of Realtors, a hedge fund operator out of Massachusetts. The founder of LinkedIn and his wife donated. Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook donated. Campbell Brown, the New York television personality. The list is just filled with these people, but hardly anybody's names that I recognize that are local. Kelly Bentley had a lot of local people. She's been there a long time, as well as some of this. Marianne Sullivan similarly. But bottom line, a lot of outside money came in. The really big money in that election, am I over time yet?
Go ahead.
Okay. The really big money in that election, though, is money that was never reported because it was spent by a national group called Stand for Children. And what they did is they took advantage of the legal situation where, as long as you're not donating to the candidate, but instead you're basically sending out things saying, I think you should vote for this person, but without their express involvement, although it does include photos they somehow took of them. But they sent out for each of their 3 candidates mailers about this big, full color, printed both sides. As far as I know, I think each candidate had 8 separate mailers that went out to everyone in their voting area. Whenever I arrived to put up campaign signs early in the morning with other volunteers, I was greeted by 1, 2, 3, or sometimes 4 people working for that slate of candidates. And Stand for Children paid them $100 apiece. So we were just massively outspent.
Thank you. So here we are, very lucky to have our pro-public education State Senator Mark Stoops, who can give us a little bit more about these connections between money and the State House.
All right, thank you. Yeah, interestingly, I came in right at the tail end of that movie, so I'm going to have to watch it again, but I think I can guess some of the information you got from it. But I was at a forum another movie on single-payer health care over on the other side of town, and it was the same reasoning of we have a healthcare system that's dominated by private insurance companies, and we are literally wasting $1 trillion a year by basically subsidizing their profit. So it's a big market for the public, and it's one that some businesses dominate and are basically feeding off the public back. Another one that comes to mind during the 80s to 90s saw a huge increase in prison populations at the same time that we started privatizing prisons. So you get private businesses that see where a lot of this public money is going, and they want a piece of that. So private companies started operating prisons, contracting out prisons. At the same time, they were at the state houses in every state pushing for higher maximum penalties. And so you saw that the prison population skyrocketed. People were in jail for longer and longer periods of time because every person in that jail was another dollar for them. So now we have, this is where ALEC comes in, and ALEC is basically the clearinghouse for the private wish list, for the private profiteers wish list, and they saw that really almost half of states' budgets were going towards education, public education. And in Indiana, we saw it as Governor Daniels, who first said, well, I'm going to help your property tax, your high property tax issues locally. I'm going to be nice, the state's going to be helpful, and we're going to take public schools off your local tax rate, and we're going to fund them. So we lost local funding control for schools. Then they cut the school funding $300 million. Mitch Daniels cut the school funding $300 million. As a matter of fact, since 2009, we've lost about $3 billion in school funding. $500 million of that has gone to charter schools. $250 million has gone to vouchers so far, and that's ratcheting up every year. But public schools still educate 94% of the students in Indiana. So Daniels cut funding. Then at the same time, there's the campaign to demonize teachers in public schools. Then there was school grades, and then the school grades were set up with this very punitive system of assessment for schools to basically force schools to fail. So almost every year you're going to get more schools failing by the system that was set up. Then once schools are failing, then there was the push for money for charter schools. And originally charter schools had to be a public institution that created them. That was the authorizer, and now anybody can create a charter school. There was money for private schools, and then as well, there was the big push for what they called Takeover Academies. Isn't that a beautiful name, Takeover Academies? To basically take over local schools that were failing. So if your school failed for so many years in a row, the state allowed these takeover academies which are just private companies, to take the school over. And as a matter of fact, the public school would have to sell their buildings for $1 to the takeover academies. And then the takeover academies were also not subject to local school boards. And so they were just a private entity. And now is the push for more punitive assessments. So you wonder why our legislature is not discounting the ISTEP scores from last year that are flawed. I mean, it was a flawed test. Technical problems. They increased the difficulty in the standards in Indiana. And so now we have, I think, roughly 30, and you might correct me on this, Steve, but 30% of our schools failing now. Maybe up to 50 that are D and F schools. And so what that means is, the way it's set up, now if you're in a school district with a failing school, you automatically get the right to send your kid, if you're just in the district of the school, you automatically get a voucher for your kids. They don't have to go to public school 1 year as they used to. They've reduced the amount of time from 6 years to 4 years, that if a school is failing for 4 years, it can be subject to takeover. That was passed last year. So when we get Representative Boehning, who's the chair of the House Committee on Education, saying, well, I don't know if I really want to hold schools harmless for those ISTEP results. I don't think we need to go that far by protecting them from this flawed grades that they're going to be getting. And the reality is that's where that money goes. You look at how many legislators in Indiana will go to ALEC. I went to a conference this summer for state legislatures. Really, we get to go to one where we can actually have expenses covered. There were very few Republican legislators there because they had all gone to ALEC. And they're not embarrassed about it at all, not one bit. So it's a shame. You can see the money. You can see how much money we've spent on our testing. I don't know the figure off the top of my head that McGraw-Hill was paid for that flawed ISTEP system that we just went through. We're just contracted with another company called Pearson. And we are literally, there are better systems out there. And there are a few legislators that are actually pushing for the better systems, but now it's like, well, we just contracted with Pearson. How are we supposed to go back on that? I don't know if I've gone off the subject, but
it's okay.
I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of where we are in the Indiana State House.
Oh, that's awesome. If you have a question and you've written it down on a card, or if you need a card, raise your hand anytime during this conversation. But one of the things that we had a question about is what exactly do they get for their money? Like, can you more accurately, maybe Mary Ann, you can talk about what happened as a result, like maybe the turnaround, not the turnaround, but the innovation, that ALEC law for the innovation school.
You mean, in other words, what has happened in IPS since the new school board was elected?
Right.
That's a pro-education reform school board. Yes. IPS has moved very quickly to make a lot of changes since they elected a different school board majority. Before it was 4-3, I would say in favor of the parents, in favor of having regular public schools with a lot of community input. And now it's 6-1 in favor of doing contracts with charter schools to operate their regular schools and selling a lot of real estate and basically bringing in a lot of privatization, but specifically the innovation schools, and you may want to comment more on this possibly, but IPS, because of the new board, went to the legislature this last year and asked them to pass special legislation that would basically allow IPS to contract with outside operators to run IPS schools. And you may have heard of another school in Indianapolis on the south side that's had a contract with another school operating company, and I'm forgetting the name right now, Edison Schools, for some time, which is what I think of when I think of this. And actually, as I looked at that contract, it's a very tiny contract. And Edison does very limited things, but the school district really still controls that school. What IPS doing is very, very different. They're basically signing a contract with a charter school operator or another private company and basically turning the school over and paying them all or even more than the per pupil that they get from the state to run that school, providing the building at no cost, providing all kinds of other services. But IPS still has to teach the English language learners and the special education children, for reasons I'm not quite sure. So they have moved very quickly to do that already in one school for this year. They contracted with Phelan Academy, which is a charter school in Indianapolis, which still does not even have ISTEP scores available. At the point at which they signed the contract, there were no ISTEP scores available for them, and there were no A to F grades, but they were brought in to basically take over a school because it was an F school, which is very perplexing.
Did you want to add anything to that, Steve?
I'm intrigued by what's going on in IPS in Indianapolis, and I think that if Rick Hess were to write his report now, he might call IPS the most interesting school district in America. And I'm intrigued partly because the people who are pushing the changes are not people who historically would be aligned with ALEC. Kelly and Marianne certainly are Democrats, very vocal about many issues that people consider Democratic issues, very critical of the governor on things like Syrian refugees and that sort of thing. Pretty solid, liberal Democrats on most issues except for the issue of school choice. And I think in Indianapolis, there's been a lot of kind of cross confusion about how people respond to certain, and people always respond to education, people always react to education, I think, according to their own personal experiences and their own desires for their own children and grandchildren. And then that becomes part of, our self-interest becomes part of our sense of the larger public interest. So I think it's really intriguing. I look at what they're doing and I can't figure it out. I don't understand how it's supposed to work. The idea of school autonomy, school-based autonomy, while it seems very appealing, that principals should be able to hire and fire teachers, make decisions about curriculum, and that seems to be kind of the basic fundamental value of the current board. The one thing that they really are not willing to even debate, really, that autonomy for schools is good and important and necessary. I really don't understand how that works in terms of personnel issues and are the principals dealing with transportation? Are they dealing with custodians? Are they doing all that? I'm real curious about it, interested to see, eager's not the right word, how it plays out, and also would like to hear much more conversation. And I think people like Marianne have tried to instigate some conversation and in some, to a certain extent, in similar to what played out in the film, it's been difficult to have those conversations, and it's hard. People get emotional. People feel very strongly about their positions and their children and their schools. Schools are very much a part of community. They're not just machines for turning students into good test takers. We all know that. They're mostly about kids, but they're not just about kids. They're also about neighborhoods and communities and where you live and your values how those are expressed by the choices you make. So it's a complicated situation.
I just want to add, I think that's exactly right. I think most people in a community like their local schools. Most parents like the schools that their kids are going to. And now the way the whole argument is framed, they see maybe the other schools as have problems. But what's going to happen with this, with the new I-STEP assessment and the passing rates, is now most communities are going to have failing schools in their system. And I think what's going to happen is you're going to see a reaction, hopefully you'll see a reaction that's strong enough to affect legislators, because these aren't failing schools. Actually, nationally, Indiana schools are doing very well. Our teachers are good teachers, and our students are doing very well. And they definitely don't deserve the failing grades that we're going to see. And that, to me, that local push is the only thing that's going to probably carry more weight with a local legislator than maybe the money they're getting from some of these private interests. At least that's how I hope it'll play out.
You know, a really good point that historically legislators have looked to their local teachers, parents, school administrators, people with, in a lot of these rural communities, those are people with considerable status. They're among the most educated people in the communities in a lot of rural areas and suburban areas. And you know, so legislators might have been like ready to, you know, throw IPS under the bus, but they weren't going to throw you know, Carmel schools under the bus or the Bloomington schools under the bus. Well, they're not in Bloomington now anyway, but I think that's changed in terms of in the way that this ideology has become more influential, and they just don't seem to be listening to those people as much as they used to. We get lots of questions.
Oh, you have so many questions all of a sudden.
Yeah.
But before we do you want to talk about the bill that you're sponsoring, because it relates directly?
Right. So I authored a bill. I'm on the Education Committee, and I was on the Interim Study Committee for Education. We had a lot of testimony, and there were concerns about what was going to happen with the I-STEP that was taken in the spring. How you know, the increase in standards. There was no delay before assessments could be used punitively against teachers in schools. We had experts that testified, experts on assessments nationwide, that said you need to give a 3-year delay, at least 2, and 3 years is more appropriate delay before you start using test scores for accountability purposes. And this was actually somebody who came and testified, I'm sure that was brought in by some of the Republicans on the committee, and they were hoping to get his point across, but with questions. It was pretty obvious that when we changed our standards last year, when the legislature required that we move from the Common Core to Common Core Light, you know, the Indiana standard version, then we had to have a delay, and we didn't put that in place. So my bill basically said that schools and teachers would be held harmless for the results of the I-STEP this year, and that's filed. It's actually Senate Bill 4. It's one of the first ones filed, but the legislature did not deal with it on Organization Day, which would have been the only day before session in January that we could have actually passed something. And we could have passed something. It's been done before. We did it last year, as a matter of fact. We passed a bill in a matter of hours. The problem is, and this is something that's important to point out, that there's $30 million that gets awarded for performance grants. So if you're in a school that gets high passing rate on I-STEPs in K through 8, your school gets a performance grant. Typically, schools will distribute that to teachers. You know, they have their own internal formula. Now there are so few schools that are getting the passing rates that would award them this performance grant. This performance grant was supposed to be awarded December 5th. Now it's probably going to be awarded maybe next week. And the legislature hasn't acted. The law says that the performance grants have to be distributed. So what's going to happen is there's going to be very few schools that get the performance grant money. The fund's going to be depleted. And no matter how much rhetoric there is that they're going to hold schools and teachers harmless in the next session, the fact of the matter is that money's going to be gone. So unless the legislature comes up with an additional appropriation next year, because it's not a budget year, then there are going to be a lot of teachers who aren't getting their bonuses. A lot of teachers. And schools, performance grants are awarded to schools, individual schools, and it could be tens of thousands of dollars for some of these schools. $100,000.
Awarded based on the percentage of students who pass the I-STEP test in that school, and also graduation rates for high schools. So they tend to be awarded to schools that are in districts represented by people with clout in the legislature.
Well, that leads us to this question about graduation rates. What is the data, if anybody knows, regarding graduation college acceptance rates from schools being operated by charters? And what is the data regarding operation costs for charter schools and the transparency of costs?
I can take a stab at that. I don't really, I think the data on charter school performance is just all over the map. There are very, very good charter schools. There are very, very bad charter schools. They tend to vary more extremely, I would say, than what I think of as public schools do. There have been some studies that suggest that in urban areas, charter schools are more effective than non-charter public schools, than regular public schools. Some pretty good researchers have come to that conclusion, but not by a lot. There's also been a lot of studies that have suggested some cities are better, some cities are worse. Depends on where you are. Boston, good, but a lot of that is very no excuses charter schools and that kind of thing. Sorry. I am. I'm talked out today. Okay, so, and the other part, funding, that varies a lot too. One of the more interesting things that I'm still trying to find out about, and I haven't figured it out, was it was Ed Delaney, I believe, right, who posted a Indiana Democratic legislator who posted some data on school funding, and seems to suggest that charter schools have been receiving and spending a lot more money than people seem to think. Typically, generally they get basically the same operating funding in Indiana. This varies from state to state, but in Indiana, charter schools get the same operating funding as the district where they're located. It's a little different in IPS. IPS, it has to do with where their students live, but again, it's pretty similar to that. So a charter school in Indianapolis would probably get about the same per pupil funding as IPS schools would, with some variations according to how much poverty and what they call the complexity index. So they don't get local property taxes to pay for transportation and buildings. They don't have to provide transportation, and typically don't. Charter schools typically don't in Indiana. And they have other ways of paying for buildings through typically state loans. Also, as Mark mentioned, the option of buying an unused or underused public school for $1 or leasing it for $1 a year. So there are ways for them to find facilities with private support, with loans and things like that. It hasn't seemed to stop them from opening or stop them from operating. It's kind of a mix, kind of a wash. I don't think it's not like it's heavily weighted one way or the other. And I think people who tell you that charter schools are so seriously underfunded compared to public schools, I think they're not telling the whole story.
One thing, it's important to point out that there are different types of charter schools. Some charter schools are very good, very community-focused, very student-focused, real nonprofits that were started for a reason. But there are a lot of not-for-profit charter schools that basically are a not-for-profit shell, and then they contract with a private operator to really run the school. So you get both, and it's very difficult to kind of figure out who's who and how this money is spent, and is it a lot of it spent for administration, a lot of money saved on the ground level with teachers that aren't getting decent wages. And Also, there's the issue of virtual charter schools. So these virtual schools, and I don't know if they had that in the movie or not. Jeb Bush is a big player in virtual schools. But virtual schools are basically your child is on the computer. You have one teacher, and she's basically beaming out to all of these children. They are paid at 90% of the per-day rate of the public schools for those charter schools. And if you can imagine, you don't have bricks and mortar, you probably have part-time teachers, if that. The virtual schools are making a strong push for 100% per day funding, 100% day rate that public schools get.
The Entertainment Properties Trust that was in the film, if you saw the film, the guy that was talking about charter schools being a great investment, that they've been active in Indiana. In the Fort Wayne area, schools called Imagine Schools. If you see Imagine Charter School, that's they're affiliated with Entertainment Properties Trust, and they make the money through real estate. Big scams in the state of Ohio involving that. A couple of them in Indiana that I think got problems with low performance, and the Fort Wayne newspaper did some really good reporting on that.
I think one thing that we see in Indianapolis that may be unique to Indiana, or maybe not observed everywhere because there are so many more charter schools, is that there's a lot of churn of students. And I'm not necessarily saying that the school's churning them, but some students will move in and out and in and out of a number of schools just during their high school years or just during their elementary school years because their IPS school may be closed, or it may become a different program, or it may have a different grade configuration when they started, or they may go to a charter and it may close, or it may relocate, or it's constant change right now there. And so kids have a lot of disruption right now, whether they're in the public system or whether they're in the charter system or even in some of the voucher system. It's very, I guess dynamic would be a good word. I'm not sure what the bad word would be, but it's hard on kids right now, although some do really, really well with it. And I want to qualify what I'm saying too. When I'm saying Indianapolis, I really should be saying IPS, because Indianapolis has 11 school systems. And you'll hear a lot of journalistic or public relations press right now, including WFYI made a mistake this morning, where they'll talk about the percentage of charters in Indianapolis or the percentage of charter school students. They're really saying IPS. And so you always want to listen for that.
We have a lot of questions. So one question here is, to what extent are the public and parents able to assess the adequacy of their schools, whether public, private, or charter? If there's a gap in knowledge that exists, how does this affect our public debate? Because this other card has here also, so we're talking about like evaluating, and in response to this A to F, the quote from the movie was, "Successful schools need creativity, not a score," was said in that movie by the one superintendent. However, local central office administrators require, in our area, the answering of a school district phones with an A school corporation. Indiana, with now these newest A to F scores coming out and being lower as anticipated, these same personnel are asking principals to explain their school's lower scores. It kind of makes us our own worst enemy. So how can we stop this practice? What would we put instead for evaluating our schools? You ready to answer? Because our educational leaders need to stop giving credence to this flawed system.
Those are great questions, and I would say, I kind of understand the impulse to want to take credit for and actually give your teachers and students credit for doing well on an evaluation system, even if the system is flawed, even if you know that the system is flawed. But how do you do that without, giving support or credence to the system that is flawed? Really, really tough question. There was a whole lot more there.
I don't know. Did you have
Steve is so diplomatic.
Well, he's a journalist. He's
He's a journalist. It's like an attorney. You have to be.
I know.
But I think it's important that we stop using the phrasing and the framing that the Republicans and private industry created to sell this whole privatization of public schools. The grading system is one of them. I think it can't help but have a negative effect on schools and perception and community. There always has been a better way, and when you find a school that's not doing well, and you find a school that the students aren't doing as well, there's probably a reason. And what we did 10, 12 years ago, the funding, it used to be after you had assessment tests. It was more of the, I believe it's called formative, where you're finding out how the student is doing, and then you can focus remediation to get them better if they're falling behind. And 10 times as much money was spent on remediation than testing. That's completely flipped now. 10 times as much money is spent, and that's not quite sure about that figure now. We've kind of adjusted it. And I was pushing last year that we could actually split the remediation and testing lines because it was lumped together and you couldn't tell. But there's still far more money spent on testing than remediation, which is ridiculous. But back to the framing of calling this education reform. They've done such a thorough sales job on this. I had a discussion with a person who's thinking about running for governor last year and talking about this privatizing public education and what a big issue it was. And he said, well, the polls show that people in Indiana support school reform. Well, they support school reform, but they don't equate school reform with privatizing schools. But when they hear reform by legislators or teachers, and a lot of times this is people fighting this reform effort for what it is, privatization. So it's all this perception that's been carefully crafted.
That's a really good point. I think that everyone knows that reform is a good thing, right? Reform by definition is to change things for the better, and if you kind of give up and label a particular set of approaches or philosophies as reform, you're kind of putting your thumb on the scale. And I think so. One thing that we can do is to push back regarding language and I'm not happy with a lot of the alternatives either. I wrote a post about this where I'm not happy with the term corporate reform because it's not strictly that. It is that. It's more than that. But just all the ways that we refer to schools and education and the things that we let slip into our language. Listen to NPR and they talk about how the new No Child Left Behind law will require states to turn around the very worst schools. Well, what does that mean? How can you say that? The term failing school, what does that mean? What are you meaning? What are you saying by that? Do you really know? Have you spent time in that school? Do you know what the reasons are for the test scores? Do you know what they've done in terms of trying to improve the test scores and other things as well? I think we have to be careful about the language we use.
I have 3 questions about how we persuade parents to vote for people supporting funding our public schools, and what suggestions do you have for increasing the awareness of this push in Indiana to privatize our public schools? This person and her husband canvassed for local candidate Damon Broadhacker, who supported public education, but the low voter turnout meant that the incumbent Peggy Mayfield won. So how do we there's a third person saying, how can we stimulate more engagement and interest also in local school board elections? So voting obviously is a solution to a lot of this, to all of this. How do we get people more engaged?
Because one point to start with is that although I've talked about large money coming in, none of that money can make anyone vote in a specific way. I mean, we could have millions of dollars come into Bloomington in a school board election, and everybody still decides how they vote. So, and this is relevant to the topic that was just discussed, the biggest thing is to have people in the schools. I mean, for the schools to welcome people into the school. And when you ask, how should schools actually be judged if not A to F, my answer would have been to judge them the way that I've always been told to judge them, is to go into your child's classroom and observe and see what you think and see if your child is happy or see if your neighbor's child is happy. And I think, unfortunately, possibly because of safety concerns, possibly because of other concerns, schools probably aren't as welcoming as they once were, and they may not be quite the center of the community that they once were. And I think that we see that in people not understanding the issues then.
Locally, we have a thing where they have community members come in and read to children, which has really been good for raising money for people feeling connected to the school. And they might hear something bad about a school that's high poverty and say, the school was great, the teacher was wonderful. So you're right. I mean, some of that is a good thing. We have 2 minutes. So this question's to you, Senator Stoops. It says, it seems to me that legislators are not driven at all by their constituents, so that goes against what we were saying, but are controlled by their parties. And when you get an entire group voting straight party lines, what do you think?
Wow, in 2 minutes? Well, I'll try to answer the previous question and this question at the same time.
Okay.
So the Koch brothers, speaking of private money, have put a lot of money into depressing voter turnout, to making voters feel like their vote doesn't matter. When they said they were going to change their focus on how they were investing, that's how they did it, and they've depressed voter turnout. They've done a very good job, since that's what they were trying to do, but it's really destroyed our political system. Legislators are dependent on their caucuses to get money, and their caucuses are kind of bent, or they're try to keep their big money donors happy. And if their big money donors is the Christian right, then that's the way their votes will go. If their big money donors are pro privatizing education, then that's the way their votes go. And when you have a supermajority like we have in the House and Senate, supermajority Republicans, a lot of what happens is decided in that caucus. They argue it out. You won't even hear it. They'll argue it out in the caucus, and they'll have their reasons for, saying this is how you're going to vote when you come to the floor. That is the most frustrating thing that I have run across, where you have, in the Senate, you have 40 Republicans coming out, and they've already been told how they're going to vote. And what is really miserable is after the vote, they'll come up and go, geez, you were right, I wish I could have blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But really, if they don't keep their caucus happy, then a lot of that money doesn't flow.
Well, I promised 8:30, so I want to say before I thank our panelists that part of this money in between is this. Was a group called Move to Amend and is now called, is it Repeal Citizens United? Reverse Citizens United. And so for those of you in the audience, there's some information out there, but you can look up online too to join that group, to join our group, the Indiana Coalition for Public Education, and to help us continue to have this conversation so that we can engage the public to vote for candidates that support the common good and that support the citizens that are like real breathing people, not the people that are corporations. So thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's a busy time of year.